Hi again guys, and welcome to another Rivals matchup on Gran Turismo, and this was actually a suggested rivalry, a three-way battle between pure, focused, lightweight track cars. The Caterham, the light car company Rocket, and the KTM Crossbow. A pretty interesting three-way battle, three different cars which, despite being very similar, are at the same time quite different to each other. The KTM, for instance, is heavier, but also has significantly more power and torque, whereas the light car company Rocket tries to be kind of a balance between everything, with more power but also low weight, and then the Caterham is more of a bare-bones sports car than the other two. The other two are more like race cars for the road, whereas the Caterham still has that old-school Lotus 7 kind of vibe to it. So, as we always do, we'll first break down each individual car, and then of course we'll compare the three to see which one, at least on paper, comes out on top. Well, first up we have the Caterham. The Caterham is the cheapest of the three. It's still 60 grand, but that is cheaper than the other two by a margin of 40,000 credits apiece. And it is the least powerful. It's still putting out around 270 horsepower, which for a motorcycle engine is very impressive. It does also, incidentally, have the smallest engine of the three, a 916cc or 0.9 litre Honda Fireblade motorbike engine. It's ultra lightweight though, which means that even though it doesn't have as much power, it is by no means slow. Now the lap time doesn't really have any point of reference to the other two at the moment, but although it was, spoiler alert, the slowest of the three cars, it's still by no means a slow vehicle, especially given the numbers that it has to work with. Now, as far as all-round ability goes, the Caterham is a little bit trickier, especially for less experienced drivers to get a hang of, than the other two, I would say. The Rocket is quite a forgiving car. The KTM is a little bit more tail-happy, especially in fully tuned form, but the Caterham does require a lot more fettling. And the fact that it is the only car of the three to have the engine in the front does make a big difference. I would say that the Caterham handles much more like a pure traditional sports car, whereas the Rocket handles more like a formula car for the road, and the KTM handles more like a Le Mans prototype for the road. That's the kind of difference that you can expect between the handling. The KTM has that smooth, measured, but very fast Le Mans style handling. Then the Rocket has more of a fidgety, but not necessarily twitchy feel, kind of like a Formula 1 car or Formula 3. And then there's the Caterham, which is more like a traditional old-school sports car. What though about the Rocket? Well, the light car company Rocket is probably the most popular of these three cars, and for good reason. It's extremely fast. Of the three cars in a straight line, it is by far the quickest, with the KTM coming in behind it, with a margin of about 20 to 25 miles per hour less flat out. And then of course the Caterham trails quite far behind at more like 200-ish miles per hour, so they're not slow, especially not for their given power, but the Rocket is far quicker in a straight line. You're looking at around or even higher than 250 miles per hour, even without slipstream or NOS in the case of the Rocket. That's extremely fast, and not only that, it has incredible slipstream potential due to its aerodynamics, and also, partially due to the aerodynamics, it has very good fuel economy. And when you pair that in with the rest of its abilities, with, as I said earlier, that kind of Formula 1 car for the road kind of vibe that it has, it makes for a pretty formidable opponent. At 100 grand, it is a lot for what is essentially not much of a car. It's very bare bones. But the fact that it was designed, of course, by Gordon Murray, who also developed the McLaren F1, means that a lot of thought was put into the Rocket. It's not a car which just jumped onto the lightweight sports car scene to make a quick buck. That's not the point of the car. This car is to the small lightweight sports car scene what the McLaren F1 is to the supercar scene. It's that more exclusive, more expensive, bespoke feeling and very expertly designed approach to a field of vehicles which have been covered by numerous manufacturers. There are loads of manufacturers in this category, many of them British, some from other countries as well, and they all have their own approach. The Rocket is one of the best all-round approaches to a small lightweight track car that you can actually find. And that brings us finally, of course, to the KTM Crossbow, in particular the Crossbow R, which is the superior of the two in terms of sheer spec. It is more expensive, of course, but regardless, it still wouldn't get the point because even the lower model is still more expensive than the Caterham. This is a 100 grand car, just like the Rocket, but instead of that ultra lightweight style and the very bare bones style of a Caterham or a Rocket, this is much more of a fully formed modern car. It has a visual style which isn't necessarily as required as it would appear, but it's more about the style as well. It's designed to look good as well as being fast, and that's something which I can certainly appreciate. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Crossbow, mainly due to the price. In real life it's a very expensive car, but on the game the price isn't as high in comparison to the other cars in its wheelhouse, like the Rocket. Overall around the track, as you can see from the lap times, of course with me driving, with my tuning on this particular track, I actually found it to be the quickest of the three, and that may be surprising. I was expecting the light car company Rocket to have quite an easy win in terms of lap time, but that's just not the way it turned out, and I'm sure for different drivers it would turn out differently. But LMP style handling does suit me more than Formula style handling, so that's probably why it was quicker with me. Maybe it's for some of you guys as well in a comparison test. And with the KTM, and to some degree with all three cars, it really does depend on how you tune the car and how you set it up, because it can either be fantastic or really tricky. Which then of course begs the question, which one wins on paper? Well, let's find out. Well, as you lay out the numbers of the three cars on paper, you can start to see different ways, as you usually can with these rivals matches, that a certain car will have a certain significant advantage. The Caterham, for instance, is much cheaper, and so of course the point there goes to the Caterham at 60,000 credits. As far as engine capacity though, it swings totally the other way, because the Caterham and the Rocket are both relatively small, being around 900 to 1000cc motorbike engines, whereas the KTM is not. It's a 2 litre. In other words, a pretty decent sized engine for a lightweight track car. It certainly has a larger engine than many other cars in that category. There are bigger ones out there, of course, such as the Elfin Clubman, which I believe comes from Australia and has a 5.7 litre engine in a similar kind of body style, but on Gran Turismo at least, the KTM is the biggest engine of the three, and of course gets the point there. As far as PP level, well, all three vehicles are remarkably high. Even the Caterham, with significantly less power than the other two, is still very high at 633, and unfortunately it doesn't really need to be that high. I think the Caterham shouldn't really be any higher than say 600, because although on a track like this it's fantastic, on other tracks, basically any track which requires straight line performance, it's just not that quick. It is, though, the light car company Rocket on this occasion which gets the point there, but not by a huge margin. The KTM is only 2 PP points behind it, and they're both extremely high, around basically Le Mans car territory, GT1s in some cases, some LMPs as well, and that's appropriate because they're extremely fast. As far as power though, it does once again swing in favour of the KTM, at a pretty impressive 547 horsepower, whereas the Rocket with around 350 and the Caterham with around 270 are much more modest. They are more expected power levels for those kind of cars. As far as torque as well, not too surprisingly given that it does have the largest capacity, again, that point goes to the Crossbow with a big margin separating it from the other two cars. But given the fact that they both have motorbike engines, in the case of the light car company Rocket and the Caterham, that's not surprising at all, because at the end of the day, motorbikes don't really need torque, it's just not that kind of performance. As far as weight, it really does not favour the KTM though. That larger engine, amongst other things, does mean that it weighs a lot more. Now still, 750 kilos is ultra light. That's the same weight as the lightest LMP car in the game, the Peugeot 905, so that's not bad at all. This particular battle though really does swing in favour of the Caterham, and it's one of the only points that the Caterham ends up winning at 364 kilos. That really is low, one of the lowest weights in the game in fact. But even so, the light car company Rocket is not far behind at all at 390 kilos, which I think is kind of more impressive in the case of that car because it doesn't really look as light as the Caterham does. But nonetheless, it's not far behind. As far as horsepower per tonne though, although the Caterham is the lightest and the KTM is the most powerful, neither of them can match the sheer horsepower per tonne of the light car company Rocket, because it manages to combine basically the best of both worlds. It has the ultra lightweight signature of the Caterham, but at the same time more power in the style of the KTM. So overall, it wins by a pretty big margin. 729 on the KTM is not bad. 739 on the Caterham isn't bad either, especially for its power, but 903 horsepower per tonne easily gives the Rocket the win. And incidentally, although as always we do not award the lap time a point because there are just too many variables involved, it is still interesting to note that, as I said, at least with me driving, with my tuning in fully tuned form on Ascari, it was the KTM Crossbow, which was the fastest of the three by a margin of about 1.5 seconds, which is not bad at all considering how quick the Rocket is and how OP many people consider it to be. Then, of course, coming in second is, by definition, the Rocket, and coming in third, a little bit behind, around 4 seconds or so, 3.5, give or take, is the Caterham, which isn't bad at all. It's the cheapest, it's the least powerful, it's the lightest, and in terms of design, it is the most old-fashioned of the three. It basically hasn't changed that much since the original Lotus 7. They've just made minor updates here and there. So for a car with a basic design that stretches back so far to still be that quick, it's pretty impressive. You've got to admire the pluckiness that cars like the Caterham have. But in an interesting turn of events, coming in joint second in a 2-point tie are both the Caterham, not surprisingly, but more surprisingly, the Rocket, and coming in first place with 3 points, so not a huge margin between them at all, is actually the KTM Crossbow, with the points as far as engine size, engine power, and engine torque, giving it that victory. But overall, all three cars, as I said at the start of the video, have their own unique personalities and their own definitely unique approaches to the lightweight track car, and they're all great in their own way. Even though I'm not a huge fan of any of the three, I do certainly have to acknowledge that they are remarkably quick cars. After all, they're designed to be. But that's it overall for this particular Rivals match, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.